What began as a quiet legal challenge quickly exploded into a public reckoning. Karoline Leavitt had gone up against a powerful judge and forced an entire system to confront itself. IT all started with a single sentence that sent shockwaves through New Hampshire's conservative base. Case dismissed. Lack of standing. Karoline stood frozen in the back of the Concord courtroom, her jaw tight, fingers still gripping the packet of voter complaints she'd spent weeks compiling. She had poured herself into collecting affidavits from poll watchers and election officials, people who had noticed troubling inconsistencies during the last cycle. She believed in the system, believed there was a lawful path to ensure fairness. But Judge Douglas Keener, a man with 3 decades on the bench and a reputation for inscrutable rulings, had other ideas. He barely looked up as he rendered his decision. No trial, no testimony, just a cold, abrupt dismissal. Beside her sat Russ Barkley, a former Marine and county registrar. "That's it," he muttered. Just like that. Karoline didn't answer. Her mind was moving too fast for words. Outside, in the courthouse parking lot, a few local reporters lingered, jotting notes with only mild interest. The major networks hadn't even bothered to show a young woman from a small-town AM radio station step forward, microphone in hand. "Miss Leavitt, any comment on the judge's ruling?" Karoline looked straight into the mic. He didn't dismiss this case because the facts weren't strong. He dismissed it because he didn't want to hear them. We're not done. It wasn't bravado. It was a promise. Later that night, back in her kitchen in Rye, Karoline sat at the table, replaying the judge's words on her phone again and again. Lack of standing. It didn't sit right. Not just because the case was over, but because it felt rehearsed, like the decision had been sealed long before they even entered the courtroom. Behind her, her father George leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" Karoline didn't look up. Her eyes stayed fixed on her phone screen. There's something off about him, about all of this. George recognized that fire in her voice. He'd heard it when she was 17, when she challenged the school board over canceling a veterans' assembly. She was older now, but that same resolve burned just as fierce. Only sharper now. But this wasn't high school. This was the justice system. The next morning, Karoline showed up at her campaign office with a stack of papers and dark circles under her eyes. She dropped the file onto the table with a thud. "I want every decision Judge Keener's made in the last 5 years. Taylor, her staffer, blinked. "All of them?" "Yes. And I want to know who his clerks are, who he's had dinner with, who's donated to his retirement fund, everything." This wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about answers. But in politics, answers are never clean, and what Karoline uncovered over the next week made her stomach twist. Judge Keener had once worked at a law firm that quietly lobbied for out-of-state political interests. His adult son sat on the board of a voter outreach nonprofit, one that had recently received a hefty donation from a PAC tied to a sitting Democratic senator. There were photos, event programs, a breadcrumb trail of dinners and endorsements, all of it hidden in plain sight, yet none of it ever reported. Karoline met with Russ again, this time at a faded diner off Route 3 in Bedford. She pulled a manila folder from her bag and slid across the table. Russ glanced at it. "What's this?" "Everything Judge Keener doesn't want people to see." He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. "You planning to take this to the press?" Karoline took a slow sip of her coffee. "Not yet. If I'm doing this, I'm doing it right." But as she connected the dots, something else gnawed at her, something deeper than donor records and event photos. It wasn't just about Keener anymore. It was about a pattern, one she couldn't quite prove, but could feel in her bones. Sleep became a stranger. Between public events and late nights combing through records, Karoline often woke in the dark, her mind spinning with questions that had no easy answers. She started making quiet calls to former clerks, retired court staff, lawyers who stood before Keener in years past. Most didn't want to talk. A few did, but only off the record point. One of them was Harold Kessler, a defense attorney from Manchester who hadn't practiced in over a decade. They met at a rundown pizza joint off I-93, the kind with cracked booze and a jukebox that hadn't worked since 2005. Kessler leaned back in his seat, eyes wary. "You really want to go after Keener?" He asked her quietly, eyes sweeping the room. You really want to know if he's been fair? Karoline nodded. Steady. I want the truth. Harold leaned back, took a slow sip of his soda, and said, He's careful. Never leaves fingerprints, but he's political. Has been since the late 90s. You're not imagining it. Karoline pressed. Names? Anything concrete? He shook his head. No, but he keeps his distance for a reason. His hands are clean, but his friends aren't. That night, Karoline gathered her team, Taylor and Jenna, and laid out the evidence. Binders, donor trails, court rulings, all leaning one way. Jenna flipped through the documents. Not enough for an expose, she said, but it's enough for Storm. Karoline agreed. We're not publishing. We're going to force his hand. How? Jenna asked. Karoline smiled. Pressure. The next morning, Karoline filmed a video, looking directly into the camera. There's a judge in New Hampshire who thinks you don't have the right to question your elections. He dismissed our case without hearing the evidence. Said it didn't matter. But we found something, patterns, connections, bias, and now we're shining a light. She didn't name him, but the impact was immediate. Her inbox flooded with messages from supporters, skeptics, and journalists. Then came an unexpected email from a woman named Dana. No last name, just, I used to work in the state courthouse. I saw things. I'll talk. They met in a church parking lot near Laconia, late afternoon. Dana, in her 50s, wiry with restless eyes, spoke low. He met with lobbyists, coffee shops in Portsmouth, always with Tommy Belt. Karoline scribbled the name. The donor? Dana nodded. And a blonde woman from a Boston firm. Can you prove it? Karoline asked. Dana hesitated, then reached into her coat and handed her a folded receipt. He never knew I saw it, but I was there, Dana said, her voice tight. It was the night before a major ruling, the one that gutted the election audit bill. Karoline unfolded the receipt in her hand. Dated 2 days before Judge Keener's decision in another high-profile case that blocked a statewide inspection of ballots. Why are you giving this to me now? Karoline asked. Dana's eyes welled with tears. Because someone needs to care. I thought it would get better. It didn't. Karoline knew this wasn't just about secret dinners or shady receipts. It was about forcing the country to confront what it had ignored for too long. Dana's tip changed everything. Karoline left that church parking lot with a folded receipt and a fire burning in her chest. Not all the answers, but something better, a thread to pull. She started with Tommy Belt, a name she'd seen before, tucked into a donor list from a Maine-registered super PAC. Dana's mention brought it into focus. Tommy wasn't just any donor. He was a connector, a man who arranged quiet dinners between judges, attorneys, and operatives who always walked away with favorable outcomes. Karoline's first call was to Anthony Becker, a former state senator forced out of office after exposing campaign finance violations. Now, living off the grid near Nashua, Becker didn't hesitate. I know who Tommy is, but you won't find him in headlines. He works in shadows, throws big checks at low-profile names, and expects loyalty. Quiet loyalty. Karoline pushed further. Would Keener have known who he was meeting? Becker nodded. You don't have lunch with Tommy by accident. If Keener met him, they were both in on something. It wasn't proof yet, but it was a pattern she couldn't ignore. Her office turned into a war room, walls covered in timelines, faces, events, red yarn connecting names across corkboards. To outsiders, it might have looked paranoid. To her team, it was a map. Then came a break. Jenna, the aide managing donor data, found a buried PDF in an old campaign finance archive, an RSVP list for a dinner held 3 years earlier at the Blackbrook in Keene, hosted by a low-key think tank, and Judge Keener's name was on it. No press had listed the attendees, but there they were, Tommy Belt, a Boston-based election consultant named Madeline Rowan, and Judge Douglas Keener. Karoline stared at the file, heart pounding. He was there, she whispered. They were all there. They scoured the internet for photos from the event. No tweets, no tagged images. It had been wiped clean. But the RSVP document was enough. She reached out to a local columnist she trusted, Daniel Redd from a national report, who'd once been skeptical of her, but respected her tenacity. I don't do hit pieces, he warned over the phone. "This isn't a hit," Karoline replied. "It's a pattern, and I'll show you every page." They met the next day. Karoline arrived with 2 boxes, documents, receipts, filings, names, and dates meticulously connected where no one had thought to look. Daniel read in silence for 3 hours before finally looking up. "You've got smoke," he said. "If we find fire, we got something real." He agreed to run the story. No accusations, just facts, laid out with precision. The article dropped Sunday. Questions mount around judicial conduct and election integrity case. It didn't accuse Judge Keener directly, but asked why a sitting judge dined privately with political consultants shortly before ruling on cases tied to their interests. The story exploded. Talk radio, local news, social media. Some attacked her. Others rallied to her side, but no one ignored her now. Then the courthouse responded. An anonymous clerk leaked an internal email. Judge Keener had abruptly canceled court for the next 3 days. Alone in her car, Karoline stared at the dashboard, her mind buzzing. "He's hiding," she whispered. But just as she prepared her next move, something unexpected happened. Someone from Keener's inner circle reached out via burner email. No name, no greeting, just one line. Asterisk, "I can't offend him anymore." "You were right." Asterisk attached was a photo. Karoline opened it slowly, breath catching. It was grainy, taken in secret, but unmistakable. Judge Keener seated at a private table in a quiet corner of a restaurant, deep in conversation, with Tommy Belt and Madeline Rowan. At a seafood restaurant in Portsmouth, Judge Keener sat across from Tommy Belt and Madeline Rowan. A server approached him with wine, as the 3 laughed and appeared completely at ease. The photo, grainy but clear, was time-stamped just 6 days before Keener dismissed the election integrity case. This was no coincidence. Karoline forwarded the image to Daniel Red with a simple subject line. "Here's the fire." Within 24 hours, the National Report published a follow-up. "Private dinner between judge and political donors raises questions of judicial bias," with a photo front and center. The reaction was immediate. Radio callers lit up the lines. TV anchors brought in legal experts. And suddenly, regular citizens were debating judicial ethics in coffee shops and grocery store lines. Keener's team issued a weak statement, claiming the dinner was a chance encounter, with no discussion of ongoing cases. But voters weren't buying it. That same day, Karoline's office received over 500 emails, many from citizens sharing complaints about Keener, but few stood out. One came from a former legislative aide who'd worked under a Democratic state rep, recalling how Keener had been described as reliable during his reappointment 3 years ago, a word that had always stuck. Another message came from a woman whose campaign fraud complaint had been dismissed by none other than Keener. Karoline read every message carefully. Some were unusable, others hearsay, but together they painted a clear picture, a culture where certain people operated with silent permission, and Keener, whether by intent or inertia, had been part of it. That Friday, Karoline called a press conference. Not the state courthouse, but outside the old county courthouse in Goffstown, a deliberate choice. Behind her stood boxes of documents labeled in bold black marker, timelines, connections, emails, donors, rulings. Reporters from across the state gathered. Karoline didn't shout, didn't accuse. She walked them through it methodically. "One ruling? Maybe that's coincidence," she said, holding up a folder. 2? Still possible. But look at all of it. Look at the pattern. You ask questions, but when it becomes a pattern, when you trace decisions to meetings, meetings to donations, and donations to direct benefits, then it's not coincidence. It's corruption with polite face, Karoline said, her voice firm as she paused, letting silence underscore the weight of her words. "I don't care who you vote for. This isn't about party. It's about trust. And when our courts lose that, everything else starts to fall." It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it, with calm clarity, not grandstanding but laying out a case, piece by piece, in full public view. The press conference aired on every local station, and by morning, a clip of her speech had made national news. Conservative pundits praised her grit. Independent outlets admired her refusal to make it personal. But Keener's camp struck back quickly. By Monday, his attorney had filed a cease and desist letter, accusing Karoline of defamation and demanding a retraction. The letter bristled with threats, but notably lacked denials. Her legal advisor smirked, calling it a classic bluff. "He's trying to scare you," he said. "But if this goes public, we might finally see an ethics probe." That afternoon, as Karoline stood in her office, windows open, folders of evidence spread across her desk, Taylor walked in holding a printed email. "You're not going to believe this." The Judicial Conduct Committee had opened a preliminary inquiry into Judge Keener's conduct. As the story broke wide open, Karoline realized this wasn't just about Keener. It was about whether the system had the courage to clean itself up. Keener didn't appear in court for the next 8 days. His docket was reassigned, his once busy chambers dark behind closed blinds. No official statement was issued, but the courthouse buzzed with whispers. Clerks spoke in hushed tones. Attorneys began requesting alternate judges. The silence wasn't out of respect. It was tension, thick and heavy, pressing through marble walls. Meanwhile, Karoline's reach grew. Fox, Newsmax, even skeptical centrist outlets brought her on. Her tone never wavered, measured, direct, repeating the same line again and again. Asterisk, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Asterisk, this wasn't about a political win. It was about restoring basic faith. But the more Karoline spoke, the louder the backlash grew. Anonymous accounts flooded her inbox with insults and threats, and someone leaked her private address online. Protesters showed up outside her home in Rye, holding signs accusing her of attacking democracy. Her father didn't flinch, standing at the end of the driveway, arms folded, daring anyone to step onto their lawn. "Let them hold signs," he muttered. "They're mad because they're scared." Karoline didn't back down. She doubled security, stayed off Twitter, and kept pushing forward. 2 weeks after the press conference, the Judicial Conduct Committee issued its first public statement, confirming they were reviewing whether Judge Keener had violated ethical standards through undisclosed associations with political donors and consultants before issuing key rulings. That word, asterisk, undisclosed asterisk, dominated headlines. Politicians began to distance themselves. A state representative who once praised Keener dodged interviews, while local leaders who'd accepted checks from Tommyville returned the funds and issued denials. Karoline watched the slow unraveling with quiet resolve, not celebrating. Yet, because each win brought fresh resistance. One night, she met Russ at a VFW hall in Pelham for a panel on election security. The room was full, veterans, retirees, young parents, some skeptical, others supportive. During the Q&A, an older man stood. "I voted for 50 years. Never miss one. I don't care about party lines. I just want to know how we stop this from happening again." Karoline took a breath. "By making noise," she said. "By refusing to let things stay buried. When you see something, speak. When they try to silence you, get louder. Systems don't fix themselves. People fix them. People like you." The room clapped, not wildly, but with steady, quiet conviction. Back in Concord, Keener's legal team moved fast, filing a request to dismiss the ethics investigation, claiming the process was unfair and biased. Keener's team called it public prejudice and politically motivated defamation, a desperate play, and it didn't work. The Judicial Conduct Committee denied their request to dismiss the case and advanced to the formal review phase. Testimony, witnesses, documents. Dana, the former courthouse worker who had risked everything to meet Karoline, agreed to testify, privately but officially, along with 2 others who had stepped forward after the press conference. The net was tightening. Then came the unexpected call. A staffer from the House Oversight Subcommittee reached out. They were assembling a panel to examine judicial bias at the state level, and they wanted Karoline to testify. "You're asking me to go to Washington?" she asked, stunned. "Yes," the voice replied. "You've lit a fire. Now we want to hear how you did it." Karoline knew the real fight wasn't in courtrooms or headlines. It was in the hearts of ordinary people finally asking hard questions. The Capitol felt colder than expected as she walked the corridor outside the hearing room. Dressed in a navy blazer and low heels, notes folded in her hand. No press, no entourage, just her, and the echo of polished shoes on tile. Inside, congressional aides shuffled papers, and a few representatives reviewed their packets behind the elevated bench. Congressman Roland Mays from Texas, chair of the subcommittee, gave her a slight nod as she took her seat. No cameras, just audio recordings, The transcript would be public later. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about clarity. Adjusting the microphone, she waited for the prompt. Miss Leavitt Mays said, "Please begin with your statement." She opened with a simple line, "I didn't come here to talk about a man. I came to talk about a system." It wasn't rehearsed. It was real. She laid out the timeline. The dinner, the connections, the quiet donor circles, the cases that vanished before scrutiny. No shouting, no posturing, just the truth. Then she paused. "I know people think this is just politics, that we're playing team sports. But if we can't trust our judges, we can't trust anything. Not elections, not laws, not fairness. That trust doesn't shatter all at once. It erodes, piece by piece, every time someone powerful slips by without scrutiny because no one dares to ask the right questions." A representative leaned forward, voice sharp. "Are you suggesting Judge Keener accepted bribes?" "No," Karoline replied calmly. "I'm saying favors don't always come in envelopes. Sometimes they look like dinners, jobs for family members, or a quiet call before a ruling. And if we keep pretending that's not influence, then we've already lost." Her voice didn't waver. The hearing stretched on for 2 hours. Questions came, some supportive, others skeptical. But Karoline never lost her footing. When it ended, she gathered her papers and walked out quietly. No applause, no cameras, just a long hallway and a woman who had spoken the truth, no matter the cost. 2 days later, the Judicial Conduct Committee released its findings. Judge Keener had violated multiple standards of conduct, engaged in a pattern of inappropriate relationships with political donors and consultants who had active interests in court cases. He was given the option to resign, and he did. The media exploded. Some praised Karoline as a force for accountability. Others accused her of ambition, of seeking power. But the facts spoke for themselves. In Concord, headlines faded within a week. People moved on, but something fundamental had shifted. Karoline didn't return to courtroom. She didn't need to. Instead, she went home to Rye, sat back at her kitchen table, and began drafting legislation requiring all judges to disclose meetings with lobbyists or political consultants. No exceptions. She called it the Transparent Bench Act. At a town hall in Dover weeks later, standing before a packed crowd, she said, "You don't change the world all at once. You change it one truth at a time." An elderly woman asked, "Do you think it made a difference?" Karoline smiled. "I know it did. Because next time someone tries to make a decision in the dark, they'll think twice." What started with dismissal ended in accountability, not just for one judge, but for every citizen who had forgotten their voice mattered. "If you believe in truth, if you believe in real fairness," Karoline said, "then speak up. Because staying silent doesn't keep the peace. It keeps the problem."